All right then. Well, welcome everybody to our Aquifer Educator to Educator webinar. It's 12 o'clock. We'll get started. And today we're going to be talking about using Aquifer to support struggling learners. So this is the last in our series of summer webinars, and we're really glad that you're here with us today. So I'm Sherilyn Smith. I'm the Chief Academic Officer at Aquifer. I'm also a Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine, where I serve as the Clinical Skills Learning Specialist there. So I get to work with students who've had a few struggles with passing high-stakes clinical skills exams like CS, USMLE CS, or OSCE. So we'll bring a little bit of that experience with me today when we're talking. So just so you all know, I received some salary support for my role at Aquifer. And Rose, if you would like to get this poll ready. So the first part of the interaction is, have you ever used Aquifer in remediation? Really, so just feel to click on your response, and then we'll see what our experience is from the audience. I'm looking forward to this because I always learn things from everybody while they're asking questions, and oftentimes we have experts in the audience. All right, Rose, if you can close the poll and we can see what we've got here. So a few people have used this and most have not. So I think that that's wonderful. And hopefully you will walk away with some great tips about how to use Aquifer. So thank you again for being here with us. So here are our learning goals. We're going to overview a framework about how to diagnose struggling learners, so a little bit of an introduction, and then really spend most of our time talking about practical tips for using Aquifer to provide additional content for knowledge gaps, if that's where your learner is struggling, or support gaps in clinical reasoning skills development or other clinical skills development. And I think Aquifer is very well suited to do all of these. Here's the agenda. So we're working through our introductions, and then we're going to turn to an overview of the pedagogical tools actually in the Aquifer cases. So a little bit of a show and tell in Aqueduct, which is our platform. And then we'll turn to the panel discussion, as I said, really focusing in on those big three topics. We'll also then have a Q&A. So as you begin to think of questions or somebody says something that you want to know more about, please feel free to shoot those questions in and we'll get to them at the end of the session. And then we'll close by highlighting a few other resources that we have for you. So some logistics notes. I think that you all probably are already disabled, but if not, make sure that you disable your video. You're automatically muted. Place your questions in the Q&A panel as they occur to you, and we will have that moderated session at the end. People are monitoring these continuously, so if there's a question that the staff can answer right away, they will do that. As you heard, the session is being recorded, and that's going to be shared with you all via email as well as on our website after the session. So here are today's panelists. So you already heard who I am, and I am just so pleased to have these great educators with me today who are going to be talking about their experiences. So I'm joined by Jensen Lewis, who is the director of the didactic curriculum at the physician assistant program at Case Western Reserve University. And he's going to be talking about how he uses Aquifer to help students who have clinical skills deficits. And really, and he's expanded that even more. So you're going to hear more about that. I'm also joined with Kindred Harland Shulgin, who is at the Pace University-Lenox Hill Hospital Physician Assistant Program in New York City. Thank you for being here. And she's going to talk about how she uses Aquifer to help students who have knowledge gaps. And so that's a really common thing that we're faced. And finally, I'm joined by my great friend, Dr. Elizabeth Stuart, who is the Director of Medical Student Education in the Department of Pediatrics at Stanford. And she is going to be tackling the really tricky area of how do we help students who have clinical reasoning deficits? Or maybe not deficits, but they're not growing as fast as they would like, or others would like as they go through their clinical rotation. So I think we have a great group of people to share their experiences today. So a little bit more about Aquifer. If you don't know who we are a not-for-profit, and we are dedicated to delivering the best healthcare education through collaborative development and research into innovative, high-impact virtual teaching and learning methods. And we're going to highlight a lot of that today. When we talk about collaboration, we have such a great group of educators who are working with us. We have more than 65 medical educators who work on course boards and interdisciplinary teams, really to make sure that all the content is up to date in the cases that you're using. The assessment tools are valid and reviewed, and so you can trust that they are testing what they're supposed to, and that the educator materials really are helping you move forward in your program. In addition to these 65 people who are in our consortium, we have more than 250 other educators who are working as case editors. They write questions for us, they create new curriculum and materials. So it really is a wonderful opportunity for educators around the country in many different disciplines to contribute. We do this in partnership, all of our work in partnership with these organizations, and these are our national organization partners. And they span the breadth of clinical education as well as basic science education, from pediatrics, family medicine, internal medicine, geriatrics, and radiology, as well as our basic science colleagues. We work with them and provide direct grants to these organizations to foster innovative research and scholarship, in addition to the $1.2 million that we provided in grants to your institutions this year to help you all navigate the difficulties that we are all experiencing with COVID. So another poll. Are you ready, Rose? So you can open this up. Do you anticipate having to remediate more students in this academic year than in the past? All right, Rose, let's see what we've got. You can close the poll. Yes, all right. And I agree with it. Many of us are not exactly sure. Thank you, Rose, for closing that. We're not sure exactly what's going to come around, and we have different ways of educating, and we're just not sure what students are going to be doing. All right. And you're not alone. A lot of that uncertainty has been shared both from the student as well as the organization standpoint. So this is from a recent communication from the AAMC, and it's really anticipating and trying to be flexible and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So if your student seems to be struggling, and you can tap into your previous experience, how those students showed up previously, or in anticipation of next year when you have perhaps shortened rotations or less time with patients, how do you think about them? And I want to share this resource with you all. I love this book, A Remediation of the Struggling Medical Learner. And it really works through case scenarios, provides a really structured way of thinking about how to figure out or diagnose what might be going on. We had some questions that were provided to us before the webinar that some people are wondering about this. And I cannot speak highly enough of this book. It's an easy read, and it provides a framework. The big framework that she shares here is thinking about the competencies. These are the ACGME competencies for residents from physician residents. And she's listed them there and then added mental well-being. So if you use that framework as like what might be going on with the student, then she provides examples. And here are the examples. And I'm not going to read this whole slide, and this is just an excerpt from her great table. So she provides even more information. But say taking clinical reasoning and judgment, we've all seen students who include extraneous information in their write-ups, and you're not exactly sure, like, why did they put that in there? It seems like maybe they're just taking dictation from the patient. or they order too many tests, or when you're asking them to think about their differential diagnosis, they can't prioritize it no matter what. It comes out alphabetical or in a mnemonic. That's just some examples of how she explains how to think about your students. So again, a big recommendation. And this slide shows how Aquifer can help with a lot of those competencies, really from medical knowledge, clinical skills, clinical reasoning and judgment. We're going to talk about those today. But listed here, these cases and our materials can really help. And if you have questions specifically about that, feel free to reach out or put it in the question and answer, and we'll try to give you some examples of how Aquifer can be used for these topics as well. So what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my slides, and then I'm going to take you on a journey into the cases. So let me decrease that. And so where I am now is in Aqueduct. So that's the name of the platform where the cases are provided. And the first thing that I'd like to show you, when I thought about having to create remediation materials for my students, one of the first places I stopped was the educator resource. So I'm just going to click on that for you all to see this. All of our cases have this. And the thing that really helped me get started was something that we call a quick guide. And so I'm going to open up the one for family medicine. And so what you can see here is it lists the case and the differential diagnosis and the final diagnosis. So this is just a listing. It's not interactive. It's not a lot of detail. But if you have a specific area that you're worried about or a student is struggling with that you may have identified from a conversation or tests, then this is a place to start. It gives you, and it will link you back to the case so you can be confident that you're picking the right cases for what you need. And so all of our courses have that, as well as more in-depth educator guides. What I'd like to do now is show you our searchable case library. So that PDF is just a quick overview. And then now, how do you translate it into an actual figuring out which cases and what courses you want? So up here is the case library. And I already have that open in a tab, so it's a little bit cheaty, but here we go. So this is what the case library looks like. And you can see there's 218 cases, individual cases in the whole case library. I guess that a pearl that I would give is really be thoughtful about the number of cases that you use. I would say a small number of cases, depending on if it's a comprehensive course that you need to create. You're going to have more cases if it's really narrowed and just a few things. I use about 6 cases to work with students, and then I can always do more. But this great thing about this is that you can sort by all different types of parameters. So if you have somebody who is having problems on taking care of women's health, for instance, and I can show you a course about that, you can sort by that specific topic area. If somebody is having problems with, say, cardiovascular diseases, you can sort by that and choose those problems. If they're having management problems, so they seem to be able to do the differential diagnosis, but then they can't create a good management plan, or there seems to be some knowledge gaps, you can create cases that the main focus is about management. Or if they do fine on the inpatient but not on the outpatient, then you can sort that way. So there's lots of different ways to be able to gather the cases that you want. So I'm just going to show you what this might look like. We have 110 cases that are in the outpatient setting. And then you can go through and say, well, I really want, using your quick guide, I want this family medicine case, this family medicine case. Lots of family medicine, obviously, in the outpatient. And then I want a little geriatrics too, right? And so you have your cases. You can mix and match, as I just showed you. And then I'm going to do this. You create a course. And then there you have it. So there are the cases that I chose. You name it, give a description. You decide that you're the person in charge. And we have an in-depth video that shows you exactly how to do this, but I just wanted to show you that you really can mix and match and customize what you are doing. So those are most of the big tools at this level about choosing cases. But what I'd like to do now is go into an actual case and highlight how to think about using these cases. Because it's a little bit different than if you were going to put them in just a clerkship and have the students work them on their own. So as an instructor, this is what your view looks like. And you can see that all of our cases are constructed with history, physical, clinical reasoning, and it's all marked for you. Testing, care discussion. And so if you're working with a student and there's a specific area that you really want to focus on, then you can have the student work through the first 5 or 6 parts of the case and then stop, because that's where the real work needs to happen. I want to show you what a summary statement is. That's, again, has really a lot to do with clinical reasoning, and it really requires the student to synthesize a lot of information. And so you can have them write the summary statement, and then after they do it, they actually get teaching, which is great. But I'll show you in the course report how you can compare what the student is writing to what the actual expert comments says. And then the other things is you can see that there are differential diagnoses. So you can really work through the differential diagnosis. And then there's great teaching here that really goes through all of the information that the student actually would need. And you can actually drill down with them about what they do and don't know in the remediation. 2 other elements of the case that I just want to highlight. First, at the end of each case, there are 5 self-assessment questions. So you can have the student complete those and then work through those as a quick way to make sure that they are actually getting the information. And then the case summary is what students use to study. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like because it's a great synopsis. One of, I think, the barriers of trying to do remediation, especially if you're doing it with real patients or in the clinical setting, is you're not exactly sure what the student actually was taught or learned or gathered in the information. And so this is a quick way to understand exactly what knowledge was taught in the case, what clinical skills. It's broken down for you in different domains. So again, depending on what you're working on with remediation, you can hone in on that. Again, we had studies. So if somebody is doing too many studies, you can talk about that. Clinical reasoning, there's that wonderful differential diagnosis table again. So those are a couple of things actually within the case that I wanted to highlight for you all. And then I wanted to show you a report. Let me go back out here for what a custom course report. So this one is in pediatrics, and this was a block course, right? And so there's a limited number of cases that were put in. And then here's the course report. So this is going to be for all of the courses, including the custom courses that you created. You can see that the students have completed the course. You can have them reset and redo. So that shows up as a check with a black circle around it. And you can figure out how long, how far they are along their learning process. If you click on the student's name, then what you can see, remember I said something about the summary statement. Here you go, here's what the student wrote, and here what the expert comment is. And so then it's a great conversation, one, to give feedback about how they're doing. There are published rubrics about how to give feedback around this. And then it also gives you insight into what they are actually doing in the case, which I think is really important. But we want to maintain that safe learning environment for the student as well. So I'm going to, the last thing that I want to highlight is that we have some other assessment tools that will be helpful for you, including multiple choice exams in pediatrics, in family medicine, as well as radiology. And then we have this other great tool that's the clinical decision-making exam in internal medicine that really asks students to work through case scenarios and then make decisions about what they would test, what their next steps were. It's based on the same licensing exam they do in Canada. So we do have additional tools if you're really looking for other ways to assess how students are progressing in their remediation. There's some in the cases, and then these are these other tests that you can do outside of the cases. So what I'd like to do now, and that was a quick overview, and I know that I probably was talking pretty fast, but so you know, if you didn't catch something, this is recorded, and we have some great videos that explain a lot of the functionality that I went over. What I'd like to do now is another poll to get us ready for our panel discussion. So which areas for you all represent the biggest challenge for remediation? And I'll let you think about that for just a minute. All right, Rose. Hopefully I waited at least 13 or 14 seconds before we close the poll, and let's see what you guys are thinking. Oh, that's the first one. How about the last one? Clinical reasoning skills development. All right. Well, I think we're going to talk about all of these, and I hope that you're going to get some insight into how to use this, this great tool together. So what we're going to do now is, let me stop sharing my screen. And all of our panelists are here. And so hopefully that you can sort of recognize who's who's here. So I'm having a little problem with my slides. So Kindred, so glad to see you and that you're here. Can you tell us how you identify struggling students and then the areas that they're struggling with? You know, I put up that framework, but do you have some insights that you can share about that?
Sure. So I work at PACE PA program. I'm clinical faculty, so my students are primarily a clinical year, so second year PA students. And one of the tools that we use to identify struggling students is the PAEA end of rotation exams, which they take after every rotation, every core rotation. And PAEA provide, like other organizations, provides a scaled score as well as a detailed performance report. And then it's our job as a program to convert the scaled score to a percentage score that goes into their grade. And so in doing that conversion, we looked at previous data from previous years and purposely set a high threshold to pass those exams with the hope of capturing more students who were kind of on the border of struggling or needed more, attention for whatever reason.
Great. So it sounds like looking at that past data and then really setting that bar and like moving to mastery, actually, right? And so when you have those students who haven't been successful, tell me, how do you use the Aquifer cases to help them, like in Aquifer in general? Like, what's your approach?
So for the remediation for the students who don't pass, we look at the feedback, the performance reports from PAEA, and that actually tells the student whether they missed, how many questions they missed in cardiology versus pulmonology. It gives them even detailed information if their issue was clinical intervention within pulmonology. It gives pretty detailed information. So we look at that, and then based on that information as well as the blueprint for that particular exam, like if that exam is primarily cardiology, so we kind of use both of those pieces of information, and then we can use the case library to look for Aquifer cases that would be appropriate for that student. And oftentimes there's overlap that the same cases are helpful for the same struggling students because cardiology, pulmonology, GI are such big topics. So what I've done is created a custom course. And actually, I think there's a slide on this that might be helpful to share.
Okay. Yeah, let me share my screen. There you go. Is this the slide? This is
Yeah,
your slide,
yep,
right?
that's exactly it. So that's my custom course that I created for my my family medicine course, remediation. And so for this particular student, he demonstrated weakness in cardiology, pulmonology, and GI, as well as other topics, but I felt like these were the three most important areas to remediate. And so you can see that this is an epigastric pain, a female with fever who also had respiratory symptoms, and then shortness of breath, which ends up going through a bunch of cardiology and pulmonology differentials. And I think the next slide also is helpful. So when you click on the case, and this is kind of similar to something that you pulled up in your talk before, but I always look at these little differentials here. And even if the final diagnosis doesn't match up to something that they missed on the end of rotation exam, the Aquifer cases are so thorough in terms of evaluating differentials that I feel like it's a really helpful exercise. And the students do too, even if it's covered in the differentials.
That's great. And so
yeah.
I'm gonna stop that. And so, you know, have you had success? So I'm just gonna, you know, tell me a little bit about like your success stories with using this. I love to hear those.
Well, so the students who don't pass end up doing the remediation assignment, and they also meet with their advisor. So as some of them are my advisees, and as their advisor, I'm able to talk with them. We're able to look at the case report, and we can see their summary statement to make sure that they were on track. And the students really get a lot out of the cases. I think that it gives a more, because it's case-based and about a patient, it seems more real to them, and they certainly hold on to the information much better.
That's great. And I can see how using, you know, like using the, when I showed that big table in the, in both in the case as well as the end of case summary, it's great for an instructor to know like actually what's being taught, so that you can go through and then make sure that they are actually getting what they need to get. Well, thank you. So Elizabeth, you get the jackpot. So people are going to be really curious about sort of how you deal with those students who have clinical reasoning, seem to have some clinical reasoning struggles, and differentiating like what's normal, like that normal, developmental process versus, there really is a problem. Do you find that there's some common issues in this area that you'd like to talk about, or what would you like?
Yes, I do think there's a huge range of issues, different ways to think about what is clinical reasoning. I have a slide that pulls up kind of two groups of issues that I think are particularly suitable for addressing with Aquifer cases. And the first group of those has to do with putting together a differential diagnosis. And really the process of building a differential has to do with matching typical features of an illness or a problem with the patient's actual features. And there are a lot of ways where students kind of get stuck with that. And these are all overlapping, but just as examples, a fixed or frozen differential is one where a new piece of information comes in and completely makes a particular item on a differential impossible, but the student persists in including it. Siloed means forming a differential for each finding rather than all the findings together. And then disembodied and impractical, again, other ways of saying this just absolutely does not fit with this human being. This is an academic theoretical textbook differential, not prioritized, as Sherilyn was saying before. So those are some examples with differential problems. The other group that I'm particularly fascinated by has to do with being able to identify pertinent information. And you'll see in students' data gathering and in their presentations, either they come out with not enough information or too much and then unfiltered, or just the wrong information. And so it's a skill that they have to develop, and sometimes it happens naturally and smoothly, and sometimes it needs more deliberate practice. So yeah, those are the areas that I see the most and think about the most.
Great. And so with that framework, and thank you, that's a nice riff, I would think, off of the big table that I showed you all before. It really like brings that out, and it's another way to think about that. So how do you actually use the Aquifer cases to help coach your students when you've identified that there's a problem?
Yeah, so if you, I guess we could look at the other slide that I have that kind of walks through a coaching framework that I use, and just a couple of things. I don't assign all of the Aquifer cases to all students all the time. And so what that means is that I'm able to use cases fresh with students who haven't seen them before. And I think that's kind of important for these particular clinical reasoning difficulties. And what I do, I have a worksheet, which you don't have to have, but these are the prompts in the coaching. And it starts with just looking at the patient's age and the chief complaint. So not going anywhere into the case at all. And before doing anything, outlining an initial differential just based on that. And then from there, figuring out, as you read through the patient's history that's presented in the case, what are the things that are going to be critical for you to look for in the history and the exam, and essentially planning ahead. And my thinking here is, it's a sort of, I think that we sort of imagine that you gather a lot of data from a patient and then you think about it. And students are sort of taught that way too. Learn a history first, and then we'll teach you about clinical reasoning and differential. But the reality is doctors don't do that. They think first about what they need, and they get what they need, and then they think about it some more. And so this kind of forces that to happen. So again, all of the first two steps there happen without looking at the case at all. And then the student goes through up to a certain point in the case. And generally for me, that's where the differential diagnosis is going to happen. And they need to look for those critical details that they've already identified. And then once they get to the differential, I have them write an assessment that includes the summary statement. And again, making sure that they really can highlight and articulate those critical details, and then revising their differential, and then go through the rest of the case. And basically this is sort of a stop action coaching, where once the student's done each step, you talk with them a little bit about what were you thinking. And then you can use the case to sort of say, well, you see here that in the case, they didn't include those things. Let's talk about that. Why was that not on the case's differential, but it was on yours, and so forth. And so I think that's kind of what I have done with some of the cases. And my recommendation is you do need to have a few cases that kind of do what you want them to do, and have breakpoints that you're familiar with. You know kind of where the differential is and what's happening up to that point. It's a little bit like having a standardized patient that you really know all the details of, and so you can control the coaching and use the cases that way.
Great, Elizabeth. I love that. Thank you for like exploding that and getting us into your brain. And I also think about these cases as standardized patients. And I think you came to that understanding way before I did, because it was like a, aha, I love this. And it's great to know what's in the case. So Kindred, I'm pretty sure that you also have a different way of thinking about using Aquifer for clinical reasoning skills gaps. Can you share that?
Yeah, we actually found it really helpful this year remediating our students who didn't pass the OSCE, which was done remotely in June. We had students interview a standardized patient, and it was a patient with a history of asthma who was presenting with shortness of breath. And we found that a lot of students had an anchoring bias toward an acute asthma exacerbation, rather than considering all the PE risk factors we wrote into this case, and you know, having a more robust differential list. So I actually, you know, it worked out perfectly that when I went to Aquifer and looked at the pulmonary cases available, there happened to be a case on an asthma, a patient with a history of asthma who was presenting with shortness of breath. So for those students who didn't pass, what we had them do is go do this Aquifer case, because the Aquifer case ultimately, the student misses the fact that it is a PE, and ultimately that's revealed throughout the case. And then they went back and rewatched their video from the OSCE, And we had them do a writing assignment where they reflected on, you know, what they did well, what they could have done better, what they would ask now for pertinent positives and negatives if they were to retake the history, and then rewrite an assessment and plan with a workup. And the quality of assignments we got was just fantastic. The students did really well with just sort of internalizing, you know, what errors they had made and what they would do differently.
That is so reassuring, because I think one of the things that when we do remediation, we're like, boy, I really hope that you got this, right? And and that you're going to be successful going forward. And Jensen, you also have an approach with clinical reasoning remediation. Can you share that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of my favorite Aquifer tools or pieces that Aquifer has is what's called the case analysis tool. And I think we use the case analysis tool to kind of get into we use it to really get into the student's brain to figure out where maybe the disconnect was. And so we actually take it a step further. We'll have the students do a case, they'll do the case analysis tool, and then we'll actually come together and do a one-on-one with the clinical advisor, depending on where the remediation occurs, didactic or clinical year, and do an oral assessment with the case analysis tool. So walk through the case analysis tool with the students orally and say, so, you know, why did you think, for instance, Kindred, you know, used the asthma PE. Why did you not think of PE? You know, just putting it right out there to get to the students. And because I think that the case analysis tool, I stress so much to our students, think about the why or think about the how. How could this be a PE? What needs to be in the case for this to be a PE? I'm actually implementing a new clinical correlations with our physiology class this coming semester, where I'm going to give them a very small case. And I'm going to say, if you think this patient ultimately has CHF, what needs to be here for you to get to that diagnosis? And I think that just open floor discussion, I think, is going to be really good. And so we use the case analysis tool for an open floor discussion to say, okay, and then why are you going to give them prednisone? The textbook tells you prednisone, but understanding what that actually is getting at, I think, is really important.
That's great. That's great. So really diving down, and I think that, you know, for you all, it's my great wish that, you know, this is awesome for students who struggle, but it's awesome for all students to be able to articulate, you know, this kind of thinking. And it's often not until you become a teacher that you have to say, well, why is that? Because some awesome, you know, learner asks you that question.
Yep.
So Jensen, the final, you know, big domain that we are talking about today is, you know, helping students refine their, you know, clinical skills. And so what are some ways that you use the Aquifer cases to help with that?
Yeah, so, you know, like I said, we use the case analysis tool, and we use it all the time, and it's in pediatric, that's where it lives, but we use it for all of the cases. We use it for all of the cases. But one thing, I've got a slide on this that we can show either now or in a second. But one thing that we use quite a bit, both in the didactic year and the clinical year, is the oral presentation skills module. Because as Elizabeth was saying, I think one thing that students can struggle with a lot, and so we start oral presentation skills day one of the program. We do interviewing. The first class they take on day one of the program at 8 a.m. is interviewing, and there's multiple students that do a patient interview, and then they have to turn around and give a case presentation, oral presentation, and it's. We've all been there. You say everything that the patient even told you, whether it's relevant or not, pertinent or not. And so we actually introduce this at the beginning of the program, and then we revisit it again in the clinical year if students struggle with some of their oral presentation skills. Because as you can see right here, skills number 2, what is pertinent? And it actually walks the students through, why is that pertinent? Why is that not? Because again, I think that And one thing that I find struggling students in my classroom are the ones that think they need to write everything down that the instructor's saying, because that they're gonna like miss this golden opportunity for knowledge. But really finding the pertinent information and hitting those heavy hitters, I think is incredibly important. So we lean on that oral presentation module quite a bit, even though it's, you know, seemingly a small skill. I think that it's important in a lot of ways because it helps them with their oral presentation, don't get me wrong, but also helps with their clinical reasoning skills too. You know, you have to think of what's pertinent in your oral presentation, and if that's pertinent for your oral presentation, that's probably going to be pertinent for your diagnostic evaluation and your clinical reasoning. And so, you know, we love that little small module, and all of our students do it, you know, all the time.
That's great. And, you know, I agree with you that it's a really important skill. And I think that one of the things that's, you know, this is all linked together, right? So, you know, even though we're talking about each individual thing, they all affect each other. And so, you know, in my work at University of Washington, you know, I've created cases, and most of it, a course with a variety of cases, just like you all have done. And oftentimes, you know, it's really interesting for me. It's the students, when they are doing the USMLE CS, right, they have to write a note under pressure, under time pressure. And so that shows up in OSCEs as well. And so their behavior changes a little bit. And so like Elizabeth, I do coaching. And then once we've sort of walked through what the deal is, then I can actually coach them. Like, how do you get prepared? Like, how do you set yourself up in the room to get your clinical reasoning ready so you can be efficient? We talk a little bit about agenda setting so that, you know, so that things don't go crazy. And then the way that I use the Aquifer cases is that I assign them and I tell them I have a break point, just like you all said. And then they get to that break point and they take notes, like it, you know, however they need to take notes that we talked about. And then I have them set a timer and say, you have 10 minutes to write that note. And then I give them a template. And so that really gives them realistic practice, just like what they're going to do. And I've actually worked with students who've been away for a while and they're worried about going back to clinic. And they've like, oh, I can write you an H&P. Can I turn it in 2 days? I'm like, no, you can't. You have to be ready to write a note in 15 minutes to be successful. How are we going to get you ready to do that? So it's the same type of approach, and it's a safe space. And then I can give them feedback actually on what they wrote. So again, it's looping back around and saying, ooh, that differential, you got 2 on it, or you got 15, and that information wasn't in the case, or what about that really important thing that you forgot? So looping back to that whole idea of standardized patients. So I found I was so grateful, and I did the same thing. I asked students, have you done this case? And sometimes they admitted that they should have done it, but hadn't done it, or they, you know, did it a couple of years ago and they don't really remember. So you have a little flexibility about where to go from that. So any last thoughts, or, you know, we're getting ready pretty soon to go to the Q&A, but, you know, you all are such talented educators. Anything that popped into your mind that you were like, oh, I want to say something, but I can't. About other innovations that you'd like to share?
You know, the one thing that I really think that once we implemented walking through the cases with the students after they've done it orally with them, I think that really, it gives you an insight into where whatever you want to call it, where the issue is. And I think it's really, really powerful as an educator to see that, because, you know, one thing in PA education that we struggle with a lot is they take a multiple choice test. You know, they do OSCEs and things like that, but what in the stem of the question didn't click? And it's many different things. And students will say to me, I know how to treat asthma. I know that you give them this, 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 and this. But then when you find out is that they didn't know the patient actually had asthma in the question. And so one thing that when I'm remediating students, we'll go through it all and they'll say, no, I know how to treat asthma. I know how to treat a PE. But it's actually seeing they have a PE. I'm not asking you to memorize how to treat a PE. I'm asking you to use clinical reasoning skills to determine they have a PE. So I think the oral assessment is really powerful.
Great, great. All right, well, thank you. And so I think that now we're ready to go to Q&A. if I remember correctly. And so Eileen, so we're going to see what people have been saying and some of the questions that people submitted beforehand. So I think that we're ready. Eileen, do you want to moderate? Oh, these are good questions. Oh, Eileen's still muted. So I get to do this. All right. Oh, I'm so excited. Sorry, Eileen, but we'll have fun doing this anyway. I don't know how to unmute you.
I actually just got unmuted, Sherilyn. I'm all set. Thank you. Thank you, Rose, in the background. Great. So our first question has to do with professionalism. I know we've been talking about that a little bit with oral presentation skills, but are there other ways to use the cases for professionalism self-reflection?
Yeah. I have a couple of, I know of a couple of things that people have done, but I want to open it up. Elizabeth, do you have you have like on your face that maybe there's something there you'd like to share?
Well, I think that what you see on my face is, I know there's probably something there, but it would need to be built a little bit. And now I'm really curious to go and find where it is and what I would build. But I cannot offer anything prepackaged.
So we, Sherilyn, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's a professionalism case in diagnostic diagnostic excellence or something like that. And we've actually had have to remediate professionalism issues in preclinical, didactic, clinical, and so we will have them go through that case. There's a specific professionalism case that we'll use.
Yeah, and that's in radiology.
Yep.
So I love it that our radiology colleagues brought that forward. And so that's what we use, is to have them work through it and discuss it. I think that the diagnostic excellence cases, there's a lot about error disclosure.
Yes.
And so if that's the actual issue and working through that, and a lot of the bystander, feelings that you have if you see something or people are not being completely forthcoming, and it's a great way to frame it as kind of, this is how your brain works, this is how the system works, and then begin to coach them through the specific behaviors. So those are the two things, the diagnostic excellence, thanks Jensen, and the professionalism case.
Great, thanks. We had a question for Kindred, and it was asking if you've done any assessment of need for remediation in the preclinical years. I know, Jensen, you talked about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Remediation in preclinical, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't at this point use Aquifer for remediation in the preclinical year. I don't do that much teaching in the didactic year, but it's certainly an area for growth. I think I've heard of other programs that use the same cases, didactic and clinical year, and the students sort of have a fresh perspective as clinical students. So it's a new experience for them, and it's something to think about, but we don't do it currently.
Great.
Okay, I've got another question. It says, it sounds like your remediation is one-on-one and individualized. Is that standard?
Yeah. So I can speak to that. So and then I would love to hear other people's thoughts. I think that it usually is individualized. I think that we're at the University of Washington, they hired me to do this because they realized that there was a need for that. Lots of other places, I would say that this falls to the course director. And because when somebody is struggling and needs some remediation, that it is always time intensive because you have to figure out what's going on. And so to have some structured tools before sending them back out to, so what I call, sort of the complex learning environment, perhaps if they're in clinicals, it's nice to have that. The book that I recommended really goes through what you need to have like the Cadillac of remediation programs, and I think that that's great to have, but most of the time it's one-on-one. I don't know if I see nods from other people. Have you ever tried, anybody else on the panel tried more than one when you've remediating?
I don't think I ever have.
No, I don't think I ever have. I'll give the the caveat is if you're seeing something over and over again, it's probably a curricular issue. And so I think that that's, you know, we had a case a long time ago where like a whole bunch of students failed an OSCE station. And we're like, oh my God, how could that be? And then we went back and looked and realized that we really hadn't taught the content very well. And so it's like, oh, so that's just like the most flagrant example that I can think of it being a curricular issue. But I think it's important to, you know, to track that. And most of the time it's individual. So thanks for asking that question. And that book really, boy, if you want to know how to do it in an awesome way, the book that I recommend really outlines that.
Great. Another question, Sherilyn, I think is probably a quick one for you. Jensen was talking about the case analysis tool, and the question is, where can I find that?
Great. So remember as I was flying through the overview of Aqueduct, you go into the educator resource area, and then you go to pediatrics, the pediatrics course. And in there, that's where the case analysis tool is. It has a whole bunch of answer keys. It explains how to use the case analysis tool, and that's where it lives. So it's you know, available as part of, you know, you using Aquifer, and you can download it. And as Jensen said, the template to understand, you know, the actual process, the cognitive process of working through the cases can be used with any Aquifer case. Only pediatrics has the answer keys. So
right.
I would think that's, you know, and it would be a little bit more work to create the answer keys, but you know, a group of people could go through and work that. So.
Great. Got another question, sort of similar. Do you have any specific rubrics to address clinical reasoning?
Do you all use a specific rubric or thinking about that you'd like to share?
I don't know if it's helpful. Not any specific Aquifer related rubric, but our clerkship evaluation system is based on the RIME framework that I think many people are familiar with. And what we've done is in each of the stages in that, so reporter, interpreter, manager, we've broken it down to describe behavior for reporters and interpreters. And I think our best way of assessing students' clinical reasoning is to see how consistently do they do each of the skills in each of those domains. And so a student what we expect is that a student can absolutely go in and get information and dump it back out in a sort of clear way. But what we want them to be doing is being selective about what they are gathering and presenting, becoming efficient in data gathering, synthesizing, and then again, the differential diagnosis. And so I would say most of the ways that we recognize that somebody is struggling with clinical reasoning is through individual evaluators' assessments that come in, and we realize somebody is not progressing as expected.
Excellent.
I see a couple, I see a couple nods from Jensen and Kindred. There is a published rubric that and I mentioned this, that it applies to the summary statements that builds on the RIME. You know, it includes the RIME. It also includes some other things that are sort of higher level that you can look for in summary statements, and they show up in write-ups and things like that. I think that, you know, going back and trying to, you know, differentiate, like, what is the output? Like, is it the differential? And then what do you need to make a good differential? You need to have good knowledge, and then to understand the epidemiology and then how it relates to the patient. So it's, I think, like doing a little bit of that sussing out, you know, is it just the differential, or is it information gathering? Is it organization? Is usually what we have to do. Thanks, Eileen.
Great, thanks. The next question is, do you have any cases addressing diversity and inclusion?
Really important topic. So all of our cases were actually, there's a checklist that we use and that really addresses diversity and inclusion throughout all of our cases. So we had a group of students who reviewed the literature, created this evidence-based checklist that we use now on all of our cases. So we try to weave it through all of the cases. There are some cases that have more of a focus on it. There are a couple of geriatrics cases, but we don't have a specific standalone diversity and inclusion. We felt like it was important, so it's woven through. And there's teaching about structural determinants of health in many of the cases, like for access to care, follow-up, and I think that geriatricians, because the management of all of their patients is so complex, think about that a lot, and it's in a lot of their cases.
That's great. And Sherilyn, if I'm not mistaken, that checklist has been published, hasn't it?
Yep, it has been published, and it's amazing. It's in Academic Medicine a couple of years ago, so we can send that reference out in the follow-up if we need to. So happy to do that.
Okay, great. The next question is for Kindred. It says, when creating cases for clinical year remediation, do you assign the topics they missed on the EOR specifically, or give randomized topics in women's health, for example?
I think the former, it's at the discretion of the course coordinator, but I typically like to look at what they missed the most of on their performance report, and then also think about the exam blueprint. And, you know, just because they did really poorly in derm, you know, a very small portion of the overall exam, you know, grade is derm. So I'm usually going to focus on cardio, pulm, GI, ortho, depending on the course, but that would be for family medicine. So that's how I prioritize them.
Great.
We also use Aquifer a lot throughout the course anyway. So even the students who are not struggling get 6 to 8 Aquifer courses cases during the course that are sort of general family medicine or general women's health.
Excellent. I think we have time. We have about 1 more minute or 2 more minutes that we can go. And I do have a question about, Sherilyn, if you could repeat the name of the book that you were referencing.
Yep, I saw that. So I'm gonna show it up again. Remediation of the Struggling Medical Learner, and it's backwards. Sorry, you have to read from the other way.
It's forwards.
Thank you. But it's great. The author is Guerrasio, Guerrasio. She's a hospitalist and internist, and it's a fabulous book. And Jen Kogan said that there's a nice framework for clinical reasoning, and I couldn't open the link, but there is one out, and so maybe we can follow up. And thank you, Jen, for contributing to the conversation. Great to have you with us as well.
Terrific. So I'm going to have one last question, and then Sherilyn, I'll have you share your slides and finish up. So last question is, do you have any case where you address humanism?
Explicitly address humanism? I can't, I don't know. I'm just going to say, I think you've stumped me. We talk a lot about, we used to talk about, there's a feel of what the preceptors are like in the cases, but I think that's a great question. I think I'll take it back to my course boards and see what they say. Maybe we'll write a little blog post on this because it's an important topic, and I don't think that anybody's ever asked me that question. Wow, what a great way to end the Q&A, by stumping the panelists. All right. So let me get out of here and share my screen. So before we leave, I just want to thank Jensen, Kindred, and Elizabeth for sharing your expertise with all of us today. I learned things, and I just have to say that the people that you teach are very lucky to have you as their teachers. So thank you so much for being here. You know, we did mention that this is all recorded. We will be sending a follow-up email with a feedback survey. And please include topics that you think would be great for us to cover in the future. recordings for the session. There will be a link, and then the recordings are also available on our website. Here are some key resources. So, you know, on our website, there's a teaching perspectives and pearls blog. So as I just mentioned, when you stumped us, we tend to put comments and topics there that are really helpful for other people, and our educators write those. We have the recordings of the previous webinars, user stories about how people use them, short videos, and then some videos and tutorials about getting started. So if I covered things that it was too fast, then you have resources there. In actual Aqueduct, we have an onboarding course that really gets you in and lets you work through some of the functionality. I showed you the teaching guides and the teaching tools, and we also have learning resources for students in Aqueduct. This is the list of all of the topics of the webinars that we've had today. They're on demand, so if there's something that you are curious about, please take some time to look at these. I think that we've covered a little bit different things in each one of these, so they're there for your reference. And then if you would like to talk, you know, we're here, we're all about the individual. I think you got that when we were talking about how we approach working with our students. We have 2 relationship managers, and they're both listed here for you to reach out depending on what type of program you are. And we also have peer consultation. So you have an opportunity to talk with educators who use Aquifer, who are in our consortium, that will be happy to work through how do you actually apply what you just learned in your program. And stay tuned. We're going to have more webinars really about topics throughout the fall. And we will have a few, we're dipping our toes into trying something new in web shop. So really give you an opportunity to work on how you would like to apply what you've learned to your own program and then take it home. So finally, thank you so much for spending the time with us. I really appreciate you being here, connect with us. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thanks again to our panelists and my great Aquifer colleagues who allowed us to do this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.